So the subject of this video is town planning. Um, and although, so I'm doing this video basically for, partially because there's a guy named Tim who's thinking of building his own town. And, while I could go and talk about things that would make a hypothetical town nice and well planned out, I think it's better to talk about an actual town than to talk about a hypothetical town. And that's, just as a historian, that's just the way I do things. I tend to work in things that actually exist rather than things that don't exist but we can conceptualize, if that makes sense to people. So with that in mind, I'm going to talk about the history of Petaluma and kind of town planning as it exists within this particular town. So Petaluma has its origins with General Guadalupe Vallejo, who had his adobe right over here. That's the oldest building in Petaluma. But as you can see, there's basically nothing around it. And so this is not really the center of the town, even though it's the oldest building. Instead, over here by the river is the actual center of the town. And I had to think about it for a while, exactly what building could be considered the center. But after considering it, I think it's probably the McNear's building, which is this one here. It's the one with a crook in it, and it's basically McNear's Saloon. And so it's the building that's at the center of the town. It's the building that's the center in the sense that everything else in the town is sort of reckoned from and in reference to that particular building. So in the case of Petaluma, Petaluma Boulevard North goes north of that building, Petaluma Boulevard South goes south of that building. Also, the other major buildings that form the town are also nearby. So there's churches nearby, as well as City Hall over here. And so kind of everything that makes up the center of a downtown exists within pretty easy walking distance of that one particular building. You'll also notice that that building is really close. In fact, it's basically a small distance away from the riverfront. And the river is pretty much the heart of Petaluma. The river is how the city accesses the Bay Area. And so ships, well, not really ships, more like boats, could go downriver, cross the bay, and arrive in San Francisco. And the history of Petaluma, in an economic sense, is really the history of getting various products from wherever they're grown in the hinterlands to downtown, onto the boat, and then getting that boat down the bay to San Francisco. Now from San Francisco, the products can get to the wider world. Even in the 1850s, where all they had were clipper ships. So 105 days to San Francisco. So this is from San Francisco to New York City in 3.5 months. And basically they're sailing the clipper ships around South America. And so assuming you have a non-perishable item that is valuable enough, it's possible, once you get it to San Francisco, it's possible that it accesses the global market. But you have to get it to San Francisco. So historically, there's a variety of ways of doing that. The main one before the invention of the railroad would have been just the regular road network. But later on, there was a series of rails. So and there are still a number of rail systems downtown. There's a station over. Trying to remember where it is. I guess, yeah, here would be the train station and platform. And then the station has a series of spur lines that connect to industrial uses. So this is a spur line here that connects to this grain mill. There's another spur line over here that comes off and connects to this mill over here. So basically a lot of transportation in order to make the whole system work. Now in terms of the town itself, I mean, it's a pretty standard layout for most American towns of the time period. We'd be talking about, like, say, the I think 1858 was when the city was incorporated. And so we see in the oldest parts of downtown, let me just flip it around so north is facing up. In the oldest parts of downtown, we see basically a grid layout, and it's peculiar to, of course, the way the river bend is. So there's a grid here, there's a grid here, and then there's the connectors such that it's not quite a perfect grid system. And then, of course, that kind of ripples out, because you have a number of streets like these that are also not in a grid system, but kind of stretch out in a web to various points beyond the city. But in general, most of the original town of Petaluma kind of sits within a circle that's about... Oh, is it working? Well, anyway, a circle that's about a mile or so from this bridge. And you could think about it, I mean, one of the ways to think about it is that if the average person is walking at about 4 miles an hour, having a town where it's kind of built in a circle such that the radius is 1 mile, then it's a town where everyone can go from the edge to the center in 15 minutes, and from one edge to the other edge in half an hour. And so that gives you... Walking speed gives a kind of sense of scale and an idea of about how big you want a town to be to make it functional, in the sense of people being able to walk places. And that's how American infrastructure and most infrastructure around the world used to be built. It was built with the idea that people would be walking around, and not necessarily riding around on horseback, or on bicycles or in automobiles. It was built with the understanding that most people doing most of the things in their daily life, they would be on foot. Now, as time has gone on and further development has occurred, a lot of the development in the east side was made in a time when the automobile was one of the primary means of transport, and so it's not it's just not not built as a grid system in the same way that the older parts of the town were. Also, it's built towards the needs of the time period it was built. So most of the places on the east side are residential buildings with just a certain number of areas as shopping areas and as industrial zones, with further kind of, what do they call them, office parks on the north and south ends of the town, next to the sewage treatment plant. So, yeah, I mean, my honest opinion is that the older style of development with blocks made up of grids is probably a better way of building things if you're going to start off new. Having a rail link is definitely useful, and a rail station, because it allows, assuming the town is somewhere that doesn't have access to a river, having a rail link might be one of the better ways of bringing stuff in. It also depends on it depends on what the neighbors are and the extent to which land is flat. Like, if land is flat, and it's an inland location, rail is one of the best, it was one of the cheapest ways of transporting lots and lots of goods. Which is going to be necessary if a town is being built. Assuming lumber doesn't exist on site, then it does need to be moved in by freight. Now, that said, a river is actually even more valuable than rail because it's pre-existing, as well as the fact that more freight can actually be moved on the river than can... it's cheaper to move things by river than by rail. That has to do with various... it has to do with I think the tonnage of ships, or the tonnage of... I'm not exactly certain how it works, but it's like when you have something on a boat, because it's on the water, it's easier to move it than when it's on rails. Or it's, or maybe not easier, but cheaper. In any event, having a town, that's why most towns are situated on rivers, as well as, the other things that a river provides. Generally speaking, a lot of towns have a water intake upstream, and then, of course, the waste treatment plant downstream. That's just normally the way these things are set up. And that said, to a certain extent, the rivers are not really natural. That is to say, the river gets modified over time. In the case of the Petaluma River, they eventually cut because the original river had meanders in it, so they cut channels to make the river straighter. And then once it gets up towards the town, they cut this channel to allow greater access for different, basically to allow more ships to dock, or more boats to dock at the same time, and then more industrial areas. So there's industrial areas that used to be all over here, and then the warehouses that existed over here that then connected with the with a rail link that went into the interior. So basically there was a whole system by which they could move chicken, eggs, dairy, leather, all sorts of things loaded onto the rail cars from the farms, and then the rail brings it to the river, and then it gets offloaded into the boat so it can be moved to San Francisco. And for a time that was the optimal way of moving the goods. Nowadays, of course, it's probably cheaper to keep it on a train and then just send the freight trains around the bay over to Oakland, and then whatever it is can be put into the intermodal containers and then shipped out of the port to really anywhere in the world at this point. But yeah, there's a lot of things that have been built up in the town. I mean, there's also a number of other things to consider. For example, the freeway. So the freeway does act as a barrier in the sense that it cuts the town in half. So there's an east side and a west side, which is basically created by the freeway. And it's a similar thing to the way the river cuts downtown in half, such that there's essentially a limited number of bridges that people can get over. That basically determines how traffic flows throughout the town. So that is one of the issues with having a freeway, that there's only a certain number of access points between the halves of a town. Now that said, Petaluma is a pretty large town. I mean, but I think if one were only to consider the main downtown area, probably the population is somewhere around 20,000 people. So, I'm not, I didn't really do the math on this, but yeah, 20,000 people existing in about a 1 mile radius of the main center on the river. Now that said, I mean, there's a pretty large hinterlands. I mean, a collection of farms that basically sort of feeds into the main town. The town doesn't really exist in isolation. And that said, there's also a number of, I think at least four or five unincorporated towns that do exist around Petaluma. The main one, or at least the closest one, would be this area here, which is called Haystack. And there's a couple of other ones. Pengrove over here, Liberty over here, and I think Lakeville over here. For a while, there had been a town here called Donahue. And there was a whole... The idea at that point was that they would have larger boats coming up the river. And so if you had a town down here, you could use a larger boat and just go on the bottom of the river than you could for a boat going up the entire river. And then the idea would be just run a rail line to the port and use that. Now, eventually, there was a time when it was easier to just move everything by rail into the next county, and then use the ports in the next county rather than using ports in Petaluma. But yeah, if I had to say, so I guess to sum everything up, the most important thing to do when starting a town is to figure out the center. Once you've figured out the center, you can sort of plan from there how to lay out a street system. Generally speaking, it's a good idea to try to keep a grid, and in general try to keep a tight enough grid that people aren't walking too far. The trend in a lot of cities built nowadays is towards, because people are in their cars so much, they don't necessarily think about things existing from the ground level in a sense of just walking around. And I mean, from an energy standpoint, it's just easier to have people walking around. I mean, that's just the way things were done historically. The other bit would be in terms of buildings. I mean, most towns historically had buildings that were like, I think there's like one of those over here. But basically it's like a residential building where it's essentially like four or five stories, and then with a the bottom one being some sort of like marketplace, so marketplace with apartments on top. That's generally the best way to achieve higher densities of people in a town, if one were so inclined to have higher densities, without making it I mean, into a really like a cityscape. Because a cityscape, it's like, yeah, buildings that would be taller than 5 stories. 5 stories, the reason 4 or 5 stories was the height of buildings had to do with the fact that there were no, before the elevator was invented, people had to walk up on a staircase. And 4 or 5 stories is about the limit of what people can walk up. The other one had to do with, in earthquake zones, buildings that were made of unreinforced masonry, like brick. Basically, in an earthquake zone, 5 stories is about as high as one can build with an unreinforced masonry building, and still have it survive earthquakes. For some reason, once an unreinforced masonry building gets to 6 stories, it loses a lot of its structural integrity. And that's just a physics thing. But the main reason to keep towns like limited in terms of scope, I mean, besides walking, has to also do with cost. So the larger a town is, the more the plumbing costs, the more the electricity costs to set up an electricity grid, a water grid, all of that. There's an advantage to having things just be smaller. Let's see, what else was there? I mean, technically speaking, even having a small town be only like half a mile in radius, um, yeah, let's see now, for people walking at 4 miles an hour, half a mile in radius, they'd be able to cross the entire town from one side to the other in 15 minutes. So half of that would be, yeah, 7.5 minutes from the edge of a town of that size to the center, which is pretty good walking time. And that's also the way things were planned out on a lot of the early rail lines, that the stations on a rail line were spaced out in such a way that people basically wouldn't have to do too much walking to get to a train. And so if you look at train lines that were planned out around the year 1900, you'll see stops are about 2 miles apart, 3 miles apart, 1 mile apart sometimes. And honestly, it's like trains were the main form of public transportation because they didn't have... So trains were you could think of it as, it's like it exists as long distance travel, but then it was also used historically in the same way we would use street buses today. So it's like, with that in mind, there's a different form of development. You have basically the idea, to a certain extent, would be, in some cases, to build a town around a train stop, such that the highest density is near the train stop. And then it goes basically a half mile out. And then it just ends, and everything after that is basically just farms. But, yeah, I mean, in the case of Petaluma, it's like things have been built up because the city... I mean, the city, from the time it was incorporated to now, we're talking about 160 years of development. And so things can get quite cluttered. Also, there's a certain amount of deindustrialization that can happen in that period of time. So a lot of these warehouses that used to be places that had where the ships would come up to load goods, and then the rail line used to exist there. So there's no more active rail line on that street. Most of these some of these warehouses have now been converted into apartment buildings, and the number of boats on the river is pretty limited. Similarly, areas like the old silk factory are now a hotel. And so there are former industrial areas of the town that are now coming to life, like they're now being converted into things, but they basically were abandoned for a number of decades in some cases. And so that's something also to keep in mind for towns, that it's like... I mean, on a personal basis, I do think that the industrial town is probably something that is a more real and tangible thing in other parts of the country than California. California, because... I think because so much has been... I'm not going to say lost, but the state has undergone an extensive form of deindustrialization over the past 50 years, to the extent that certain areas have become unrecognizable. And California is a unique case because a lot of people who are in California moved in during that time, as deindustrialization was going on. So a lot of people in California don't actually, unless they crack open a history book, they would actually never know how industrialized this state really was historically. It just wouldn't be something that registers in their minds. But, yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of places. Like, this place here is basically I think this particular lot is basically another one of those abandoned lots. I forget what it was historically, but I think right now it's one of those lots where it's mostly being used by, people on the margins of the society trying to survive. So it's not like it's going unused, but now that said, Petaluma probably is more industrialized than I think most California towns. There's still grain silos and all sorts of industrial equipment that exist in order to feed the animal populations that exist on the farms surrounding the city. I should probably say, yeah, I mean, depending on how people view things, on paper it's considered a city because it does have a population of 60,000 people. Although honestly, I consider it to be something of more of like a large town. But that said, I mean, considering walking distance, I mean, one could almost treat it, it's like downtown is kind of like its own thing. And that is the case, I suppose, with a lot of cities, is that they are, once something gets big enough, it almost starts to function as multiple things rather than one unit. And that's just based off of kind of the way things get divided up. So, I mean, the river divides things up, the highway divides things up, the main street divides things up, the other streets divide things up. And so you do have people kind of have a, depending on what side of the street they live on, there's a, how do you put it, neighborhoods develop. And so it would take, I mean, I don't know what it is exactly is the maximum size you can have a town where it will just be one neighborhood. I would have to guess it would probably have to be maybe a little bit over half a mile in radius, such that it's like, okay, you know, you can, from the edge of town to the center, you can walk, and it only takes 10 minutes, and then another 10 minutes and you're at the other edge. I think that's quick enough that basically you have maybe, you know, maybe there's a, you know, an east side and a west side, or a north side and a south side, but two neighborhoods basically, and kind of keep it simple. But yeah, let's see, what else was there? Oh yeah, so the train line, I mean, in a lot of towns, there is the question of right-of-way and building up a right-of-way. And definitely right-of-way for a train line as an area becomes more and more developed, having a right-of-way becomes more and more valuable. In terms of Sonoma, it's like the SMART train right-of-way, which is the passenger rail line that kind of goes through this region. Over the course of both counties, I think the line is worth like $1 billion. And that has to do with the value of the land, such that it's like purchasing all the parcels of land trying to make a similar route nowadays would cost $1 billion. And so there's a tremendous value in having planning out a right-of-way beforehand in order so that there's room for a rail line and then possibly also just enough room to do double tracking. And basically the idea there would be to have double tracking such that in that area you can have a train going in either direction. And so there is an advantage to that, as opposed to a tighter place where there's only room for a single track. Now, on a personal note, I would say that there is also an advantage in having something like a bike path on either side of a rail line. Just in terms of like being able to have people move around without necessarily, I mean, either a bike path or, and you can see it like here, they've got like a frontage road that goes, or not well, a road basically that goes alongside the rail line. And I think that's useful from a transportation standpoint, just having the rail line basically have roads, either one road or two roads on either side of it, so that people can get around. It's like it is a bit messy having a situation where people like get to the rail line along a road and then it's suddenly like the road ends. Being able to go alongside the rail line, I think there's some kind of a transportation factor to that. Let's see, what else is there? Oh yeah, and then there's also a town airport. Part of the reason Petaluma has an airport is that they, very early on in the history of aviation, there was a guy named Wiseman who made the first airmail flight in United States history. He flew from Petaluma to almost to Santa Rosa, and it's considered to be a historic flight. His plane is preserved in the Air and Space Museum in the Smithsonian. The guy was pretty... is a very intelligent fellow. He's able to basically build an airplane after seeing what airplanes look like from newspaper reports of the Wright brothers. And I think he had a workshop up in... it was somewhere farther north in the county, but he started his flight from Petaluma. And so the town has a municipal airport, and with regard to the airport, I mean, it's in such a location that if the town wished to make it larger, it could be made larger. So that is the thing with airports. It's like, if you do want an airport, it's like having room for expansion is a helpful thing. I mean, the thing about an airport is it takes a lot of land, it has to be flat land, and then there's also the question of prevailing winds. So in the case of Petaluma, there was just enough land and the town was situated such that it was really easy to put down an airport, such that it aligns with the prevailing winds, so people can take off and land appropriate to the wind direction. Let's see now. Oh yeah, there's a number of creeks throughout Petaluma, and then there's like creekside bike paths, and that's pretty useful and pretty handy. So in cases where it's like, if you got a road here, and then the road meets the river, and then the road basically ends, having a creekside bike path is really useful, so people can move around from place to place where normally a road would end, and they can kind of still move around, and I mean, it basically increases people's ability to walk places. It's good for dog walkers, because essentially the dogs can go down by the river, and you don't have to worry too much about the waste problem. And I mean, in general, people also just like walking by the river. It's a very nice natural feature, and it's a lot more useful in some sense than something like, say, you know, a planned park, where they kind of have to plan all the amenities. People can walk around a park, but there's really not, it's not like they're going anywhere, they're just in a park. You know, whereas with the river, it's like people can walk, and it kind of just keeps going. So you can think of a river almost as like a very, very, very long park. And the same thing with creeks. Creeks can also be thought of as a very long park. Now that said, you know, I mean, I think towns do have to get a bit creative in terms of how to use and integrate the space. Let's see, what else does the town have? Oh yeah, there's also Fairgrounds, so that's, I guess something to think about would be an event space. Although, you know, I don't know exactly what events would be people would have in mind. I mean, that's the thing. It's like, in some ways, you can't know ahead of time what a town is going to be good at. In the case of Petaluma, when they laid out the grid, I think it was just a few years before that one guy in town invented the chicken incubator. So when they incorporated the town and laid it all out, it wasn't known then that chickens would become the thing that would build Petaluma. So that is one of the things in town planning, is that you kind of lay out a general plan, but then things are just going to happen. Whatever the trade good is that the town produces, it starts the trade good begins to dictate the development of the town. That's just how things work. And that is one of the problems. It's like over-planning can lead to a situation where people plan for something and then it doesn't correlate to what's actually being produced. And then, of course, in cases of under-planning, it's like, I mean, it can happen that people lay out a couple of roads and then you end up with stuff getting filled in. It doesn't quite get filled in properly. And you can tell, I mean, in cases like here, where it's like, they didn't they didn't extend the regular grid, and so you have roads that are coming off at various angles, and then it's like they didn't. Although they could have very easily built up a regular grid system, they just weren't able to do that. And then as it goes further out, it becomes, I'm not even quite sure if this is still part of the town, but everything just becomes more and more haphazard. So there is a question in terms of laying out a town. It isn't just about laying out the town itself, but it's also the question of expansion. That is to say, what's the best way for a town to expand? Now, I have seen videos on I think, Savannah, Georgia, where people have talked about that being a very interesting town plan, because it's built up as kind of it's not a, how to describe it. It's like a grid system, except they took out, they replaced sections of the grid with like a park. So they have like buildings and then like a park as an interior green space. And then and then that's set up as a ward, and then they repeat that as a unit. At least that's how I understand it in that particular town. It's interesting because that's, and I guess I'll put a link to it below the video of people talking about that, because it's a unique town plan. It's unique to that particular town, which grew into a city. That is one of the other things to think about towns. If a town becomes really, really successful, and it has the land to keep growing, it will grow into a city, even if that's not necessarily what has been intended. I mean, in a lot of cases, it's like, honestly, although Petaluma is one large town, I honestly think that it does kind of function in some ways as like two or three small towns, in the sense that there are people who can basically stay within their quarter of the town and find most of the services they need without having to travel into another quarter of the town. So that is something to think about, and probably one of the differences mentally between a large town and a city, or sorry, between a large town and a small town. But a small town, it's like it's small enough that there's things would be located such that you actually the idea of not having to travel throughout the entire small town to get what you need would be I guess it goes to the idea of like a shared space. If people can find everything they're looking for in their particular area, then it's like the entire town is no longer a shared space. Now that said, in practice, a lot of areas, I mean, certain things are, as the town grew, certain things are just more specialized. Like the airport is a specialized area. The community called Yeah, the community college is also a specialized area. The, what do you call it? The hospital and the adjoining, medical offices are also a specialized area. So that does happen, that there are basically specialized, as a town grows larger, one does end up with like really niche specialized areas, and I suppose the hospital is probably the best example of that. That it's something that's necessary for the town, and it's like it's a function that realistically um, has to take up a lot of land and can't necessarily be placed downtown. Let's see now. Bridge, pedestrian bridge, drawbridge. I mean, depending on river traffic, it does make sense to have drawbridges. Um, because you just would need drawbridges if boats are going to use the river and they can't pass underneath a regular road bridge. Um, let's see. I think that's most of it. Um, I suppose the other thing would have to do with land use. Having a parking garage. Yeah, even though a parking garage is expensive, basically it's like if there's going to be a large number of cars, a parking garage just becomes the most efficient way to basically pack cars into a town. Um, as opposed to having parking and then having just a bunch of parking lots everywhere. And that is the thing, is if you look at things like was it strong towns, when they talk about having a street, what makes a street valuable in terms of money is having the buildings go right up to the sidewalk, buildings pretty much everywhere, so that so the buildings generate the foot traffic economically, and then that runs the basically the economic engine of the town, is people going to those various shops. Let's see, what else is there? Oh yeah, and then also there is the question as well of whether having uh, two-way streets where you got traffic going one way, traffic going the other way, or one-way streets where basically there's just one prevailing direction of traffic, and then um, having a one-way street allows the street itself to be narrower, and in some cases, if you have like angled parking, because it's a one-way street, you can fit more cars along the street, and the cars themselves form like a physical barrier, such that what is it? They say it makes the people who are walking on the sidewalk feel protected from traffic because the cars have formed a barrier. So there's all sorts of little tricks like that one can consider. Um, let's see. Oh yeah, then this thing here, like a circle. Um, I know in Europe they have a lot of what are they called? Roundabouts. Basically, yeah. It's like you have instead of a stop sign system, you have a circle. Um, circles are circles and roundabouts. They're more efficient than having a stop sign because the cars don't have to stop if there's no one. They just have to yield if there's someone coming in the circle. And so I think there was like a Mythbusters test on that where they compared a system with a roundabout to a system with stop signs, and the roundabouts just it was just more efficient. And I mean, it's a pretty simple way of doing things, such that you have better laying out a town with a certain number of roundabouts. There would be better traffic without necessarily needing to incur the cost of having, a traffic light. Basically, it's just, once you build it, it works. If that makes sense. Let's see. Oh yeah, trees. I guess it makes sense to have trees. Towns that have trees are more valuable. And basically, the trees provide shade for people as they're walking along. Um, and I mean, depending on the land you're building on, it might be entirely possible that it's like the natural trees that are already there, you might not even need to take them out. You just build the sidewalk such that the trees are just there. So that is a thought. Now, generally speaking, I guess trees, it's like in a really sunny area, the trees become much more valuable because the shade they provide. But even in a northern area, they're also valuable because they act as a windbreak. Because it's like a street without trees. In a cold area, it's like the wind would just become more harsh. Because it could blow quicker. Um, let's see, what else? Parks, I mean, it's like if you're building a city from the ground up, it's like in some cases, yeah, you could probably do the same thing with a park as well. Just designate a certain patch of grass where it's like, yeah, this is the nice patch of grass. We're gonna leave this as a park. And just kind of leave it as an empty field. And yeah, I think that's basically it. Um, it's kind of difficult in some cases to just think of like everything a town might need, but I think these are good points, and they probably could help you in you or anyone really in trying to create a town. I'll probably put a bunch of links in the description on different things where people talk about basic ideas behind building a town. I know strong towns, it's like they've got all sorts of points on kind of the density people want in terms of shops. Shops, it's where it's like you need a certain density of shops in order to get the tax revenues necessary to have a profitable town. And so they can explain it a lot better than I can. And yeah. Alright, bye.